Our speaker today needs no introduction, so I'll keep it short. Michael Morand is our wonderful Director of Community Engagement here at the Meineke Library. Not only has he spent countless hours studying and uplifting the work of the great civil rights leader and father of Pan-Africanism, W.E.B. Du Bois, but he also happens to be a board member of the W.E.B. Du Bois Museum Foundation. They have a mission of honoring the life of Du Bois by redeveloping his final resting place to revive the current Memorial Center. And though Du Bois's final resting place was abroad, he had many connections to New Haven, with his grandparents being buried here, his wife being a Yale graduate, him having close friends residing in New Haven, and of course, the papers of his being donated to Yale. Now, this will be a longer presentation, so if there are questions, if we have time at the end, we will be sure to get to them. But for now, Michael, I now turn it over to you. The screen is yours.
Thanks so much, Tobias, and thanks everyone for joining with us this afternoon. I want to weave a web of connections. Du Bois contains multitudes, and there are many points of connection to Du Bois and from Du Bois to the world. The primary home of Du Bois's papers are at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. But as David Levering Lewis notes in his magisterial Pulitzer Prize-winning biography, there are many collections with Du Bois papers, of which Yale is one of nearly 20 different institutions that complement the extraordinary holdings at the University of Massachusetts. What you see here are the boxes of the Du Bois collection and other archival collections and a number of monographs by Du Bois and his second wife, Shirley Graham Du Bois, in the Meineke Library reading room. The set here is dressed with a cloth that I purchased in Makala Market in Accra, Ghana, that features a spider web. In Du Bois's home, in what's now his library, there is actually one of these cloths, and it is said that Du Bois himself favored this kind of wax print cloth with a spider's web, perhaps a play on W.E.B. And I want to, as we get into the conversation about the archives, thank the extraordinary web of scholars, archivists, activists, archives, museums, institutions, and organizations who over time and in our time have and do provide such extensive and extraordinary access and insight into the life, work, and legacy of Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois. First and foremost, the special collections in the University Archives of the University of Massachusetts Amherst Library and the Du Bois Center there, and to David Levering Lewis, all of us are in their debt for what they have done and continue to do. As I noted, there's 20 plus other archives and collections, including the papers that Du Bois gave here to Yale Library. I want to also thank many different colleagues of mine, including Henry Louis Gates Jr. and Anthony Appia, colleagues on the Du Bois Museum Foundation, and in many ways, the heirs of Du Bois' legacy with the Encyclopedia Africana. Many New Haven colleagues, especially local historians, Jill Snyder, Charles Warner Jr., and Frank Mitchell. All of my colleagues here at Yale, especially in the Meineke Library, and my many colleagues in Ghana, especially those with the W.E.B. Du Bois Museum. Du Bois probably needs no major introduction, but it is worth remembering his importance and impact. I think we could all agree that one cannot be an intelligent human being in this world and not know Du Bois. And if we know Du Bois, we are more intelligent ourselves and are able to make better sense of the world in which we live. Brief quote from David Levering Lewis's biography, which reminds the quote, born in Massachusetts in the year of Andrew Johnson's impeachment and dead 95 years later in the year of Lyndon Johnson's installation, Du Bois cut an amazing swath through 4 continents, writing 16 pioneering or provocative books of sociology, history, politics, and race relations. In his 80s, he found time to finish a second autobiography and produce 3 large historical novels. First African-American to win a Harvard doctorate. Du Bois was one of the founders of the N.A.A.C.P. and the fearless editor of its monthly magazine, The Crisis. One could go on. As Tobias noted, Du Bois is the father of Pan-Africanism. He, as I said, contains multitudes. On the screen is the first edition of The Souls of Black Folk, one of the most important books ever written, a book that is at once timeless and timely. And on the right is a note from Langston Hughes to Du Bois. The typescript is here, carbon copy, sorry, in the Meineke Library, where Langston Hughes notes that he's just finished reading The Souls of Black Folks for, quote, perhaps the 10th time, underscoring the impact of this one book, one of many books that Du Bois wrote. The connections with New Haven, as Tobias noted, begin with Du Bois's grandfather, Alexander Du Bois, and his grandmother. His grandfather was very important in Du Bois's life. On the left, you see a quote from Du Bois's autobiography about his grandfather, who he noted, quote, held his head high, took no insults, made few friends. He was not a, quote, Negro, he was a man. And Du Bois writes more about his grandfather in his autobiography. Encourage all to read that if you haven't. On the right is some of his own research in the University of Massachusetts Amherst libraries about his grandfather. His grandfather lived in New Haven in the 1830s and 40s. There's more to be done, and encourage folks who are interested in exploring on their own in city directories and other materials. But we know that his father lived on Washington Street in what we know as the Hill neighborhood. And his father had a long relationship with St. Luke's Church and would have worshiped originally at the white Episcopal Church, Trinity Church. You see on this map some of the places that Alexander Du Bois would have known. At one point in his career, Du Bois was between New Haven and New York because he worked on the steamboats. So you see the steamboat landing, Washington Street, the various sites of Trinity Church, including its chapel, where Black Episcopalians began to worship, and the first home of St. Luke's Church that was its own church on Park Street, as well as its eventual home after this Alexander Du Bois' life on Whaley Avenue, where it is now. This is a view on the left of what Washington Street probably would have looked like during Alexander Du Bois' time, now Washington Avenue. This map is about 30 years after Du Bois's living in the area, but it still probably gives us some sense of what it would have been like. Houses very close together, a teeming neighborhood. Du Bois, the grandfather, was a grocer, among other things. On the right, you see a view more or less of what this area looks like now from Google Street View. As I mentioned, Alexander Du Bois was an important figure in the founding of St. Luke's Church, the first Black Episcopalian church in Connecticut, one of the first in the nation. On the right, you see an image from the early 1900s from the Park Street Church of Trinity, which would have been a church that Alexander Du Bois would have known. And on the left, you see one of the key early figures in St. Luke's Church, Alexander Crummell. Crummell is someone who more needs to be known about locally on campus. There are those who carry community memory in St. Luke's Church who know much about Crummell. There are some around campus who know about Crummell. More of us should learn more about Crummell and his time at Yale and in New Haven. He was of an era with James W.C. Pennington, a student who studied at Yale but was not allowed to enroll formally, to matriculate, to borrow books to speak in class. Like Pennington, he studied at Yale but could not be formally enrolled. He left Yale after a number of years, was in New Haven, and met often with the Black Episcopalians. They were hoping that he would be pastor of St. Luke's Church. He was a key figure in the early Black Episcopalian, independent Black Episcopalian community in New Haven, and would have been somebody that Alexander Du Bois knew very well. Crummell would go on to a long and distinguished career in this country and abroad, in the church and in the liberation movement. On the left, you see some pages from the Du Bois papers at UMass that are from Alexander Du Bois, that are notes of lectures, meetings that Alexander Crummell had in Black households in New Haven, and the collection that was raised at each of those. As David Levering Lewis notes, Crummell was an important figure in Du Bois's life. This is a quote from Lewis. Crummell was the first living Black man Du Bois had found truly worth emulating, the first to whom he deferred with ready affection and intellectual affinity. W.B. Du Bois would meet Crummell in the late 19th century and had to have known that his grandfather knew him in New Haven. In The Souls of Black Folk, you see on the right the table of contents. Those who know this book know well that there is a chapter dedicated of Alexander Crummell. So an important figure in New Haven, an important figure in the world, an important figure for Du Bois. The connections of Du Bois in New Haven include the Grove Street Cemetery, where Alexander Du Bois and his wife, W.B. Du Bois's grandparents, are buried. They are buried here in a section that was an early section for Black burials at what would have been at this time the edge of the cemetery. The cemetery was expanded later. It's next to what is now the office and had been a chapel. So you see it here, and when you enter Grove Street Cemetery, it's just to the left. This is notable because it's Du Bois's grandparents, but it's also notable because Du Bois and his second wife, Shirley Graham Du Bois, intended to be buried here. In fact, in Du Bois's autobiography, where he talks about his grandfather, he notes he's buried in Grove Street Cemetery, where I shall be eventually. And there's lots of correspondence in the Du Bois papers at the University of Massachusetts Amherst between Du Bois, Shirley Graham, the mayor of New Haven, and the superintendent and head of the cemetery, where, among other things, Du Bois is told there is a family plot, but that the grandfather had not paid perpetual care, so there were fees due. And in fact, there is a canceled check showing that Shirley Graham had sent payment to the cemetery in New Haven because they did intend, circa 1953, 1954, to be buried in New Haven. Of course, as it happened, Du Bois and Shirley Graham moved to Ghana at Kwame Nkrumah's invitation and are buried there in eternal rest at their final home in Accra. I love this letter that's in the UMass papers, which shows another time, the ongoing ties of Du Bois with New Haveners. So this is a letter from the wife, Viola White Goyne, of the pastor, Edward Goyne, of the Dixwell Avenue Congregational Church. Du Bois, in the Du Bois papers, there's lots of correspondence between New Haveners and Du Bois back and forth. And this one is interesting because Mrs. Goyne notes that the church had just found the Beeman scrapbooks, which are now in the Beinecke Library, placed here by Dixwell Church. And that in those scrapbooks, there was a letter from Noah Webster responding to a question from the Reverend Mr. Beeman, the first Black full-time minister of Dixwell Church, who had asked Webster about the history of Africans. Webster had replied with a white supremacist, racist response about Africans. And Mrs. Goyne notes the delicious irony that Du Bois's grandfather is buried in the same place as Webster. And she says, and I quote, I wonder if Webster knows now he lies so near the grandfather of a man who has proved him so ignorant of the matter. A second key connection, longtime connection of Du Bois is with George Crawford, graduate of the Yale Law School, who David Levering Lewis notes was one of Du Bois's closest and ablest friends, an ally for decades in various efforts, including battles within the N.A.A.C.P. In 1911, Nina Gomer Du Bois's first wife, actually lived in New Haven while Du Bois was overseas and was looking for a home for them, including their young daughter, Yolande. And so she's writing from 268 Park Street, which is more or less where St. Thomas More Chapel is now on the Yale campus. And she writes that she has been going around town looking at houses with George Crawford. So he was clearly the sponsor of Mrs. Du Bois. As it happened, they chose to live in New York, not New Haven, but this is another New Haven tie, but the particularly important one is with Crawford. In 1903, graduate of Yale, the first Black probate judge in New Haven, a longtime centurion of the New Haven community and of the 20th century civil rights community. He was at the first Amenia conference organized by Du Bois and in fact led the session there on civil and legal discrimination. David Levering Lewis notes that, again, Crawford was, quote, one of Du Bois's most loyal yet critical allies. He was with Du Bois throughout his career, was willing to challenge Du Bois, but stood by his side as others attacked Du Bois, which was not infrequent. Another connection of Crawford and Du Bois in New Haven, Crawford was active with the Masons and in fact wrote a history called Prince Hall and His Follows about Prince Hall and Black Masonry. And Crawford is no doubt responsible for the fact that in 1912, W.B. Du Bois was raised to Master Mason at the Widow's Son Lodge here in New Haven. So Du Bois is a Mason and he's a New Haven Mason. There are also many connections of Du Bois over time, as I mentioned, especially with Dixwell. Du Bois spoke in New Haven a number of times, including in 1906 with St. Luke's Church. He had spoken to the Dixwell Congregational Men's Club. There's much correspondence with Dixwell Community House and the Dixwell Avenue Congregational Church. And in the Crisis, which Du Bois founded and edited for decades, there are many articles and notes about Dixwell Church, Dixwell Community House, and the Community House's Dixwell Players. On the left is a picture and article when Dixwell Community House, what we know as the Q House, opened in just after it had opened in 1924. And on the right are some images from the Du Bois papers that include a program of the Dixwell Players, which used an image from the Crisis that they were able to use at Du Bois's permission. Another key connection that folks may not know about is this book, The Gift of Black Folk, done in 1924 by Du Bois, which was published by the Knights of Columbus, a Roman Catholic fraternal organization founded and headquartered here in New Haven. The genesis of this was as part of a series called the Knights of Columbus Racial Contribution Series, which also had books about the contributions of Germans to America and Jews to America, written by leading scholars from communities, from the Jewish community and from the German American community. And the genesis of this was because the Knights of Columbus were the leading predominantly white organization against the Ku Klux Klan. The second Klan, which had begun in the 19-teens and continued strong in the 1920s, was a group that was against Black Americans, Jewish Americans, and immigrants and Catholic Americans. So the Knights were, as it were, an early intersectional organization politically, and were the leading predominantly white organization against the Klan in the 1920s. Part of that effort was this series, which was offering up the power of America as a conglomerate, as a mosaic. We have a number of copies of this, including a copy owned by William Pickens, an early graduate of Yale and an early leader in the NAACP, with his notes. And in this book, you see that there is a chapter called The Reconstruction of Freedom. This is one of the earliest instances of Du Bois publishing, and probably the first in book form, of an argument that would be expanded and become the extraordinary book Black Reconstruction in 1935. So I encourage people to get to know the gift of Black folk and its history, which is rooted here in New Haven, more. Another connection of Du Bois and New Haven is with Shirley Graham, his second wife. Shirley Graham studied and has a degree from the Yale Drama School. You see here a book of Yale radio plays that includes one by Shirley Graham, plays that were written here at Yale and were done on WICC radio in New Haven. In the Du Bois papers at UMass, there are many letters from Shirley Graham to Dr. Du Bois. It notes that she lived at 45 Dickerman Street. In the first from when she's here, it says, quote, "Yale is all that I expected and more." Later on, 2 years later in 1940, she's not in such a good mood because she's looking for a job and isn't having any success at the time in finding a job. She lived in New Haven for 2+ years, had a number of different plays, including, you see here, the program from a play called Dust to Earth that was one of her productions while she was on campus. And this shows a little bit of where Shirley Graham was. On the bottom, you see where the green is in the Yale campus, including the drama department, Dixwell Community House, which she probably would have known. She lived her entire time in New Haven on Dickerman Street, just behind St. Luke, where St. Luke's Church is now and has been since 1907, and across the street from a home that would be the home of the Motley family. Constance Baker Motley, of course, a great New Havener who was raised in the St. Luke's Church in the Dixwell Community House, would go on to be the first Black woman federal judge in our country, a great New Havener. This is a photograph of Shirley Graham with many of the leading luminaries of the James Weldon Johnson Memorial Collection at its opening in the Yale campus in 1950. You see Mrs. Johnson in the center there, and to her left, our right, is Shirley Graham. And this underscores another set of connections of Du Bois with our community, which is the W.E.B. Du Bois collection in the James Weldon Johnson Memorial Collection. Du Bois lives in the archives here as he lives in archives, libraries, museums all around this country and in other countries. The Yale archival collections with Du Bois materials include not only the Du Bois collection that he gave, but papers of others, including the Countee Cullen collection, Langston Hughes, Victor Jeremy Jerome, James Weldon Johnson and Grace Nail Johnson, Joel Spingarn, Anson Phelps Stokes, C. Van Woodward, and a number of key collections related to the NAACP and its history. There are also in the archives many periodicals and books. We have a substantial run of the Crisis magazine that Du Bois founded and edited for more than 2 decades. We have a substantial run of the Brownies book, his children's periodical, and we have the first and other editions of many books by Du Bois and by Shirley Graham, donated by them, by other people, including the Johnsons, Van Vechten, as well as in the Gray collection in the history of social thought. The James Johnson and Grace Nail Johnson papers hold many, many pieces of correspondence from Du Bois. They also have key items related to the epic 1917 NAACP silent protest parade, which Du Bois and Johnson were key figures in. One of, if not the first, mass protest of Black Americans for political rights and against white racist violence. 10,000 people marched down Fifth Avenue on a Sunday in July 1917. Again, encourage those who don't know to take this as a prompt to find out more about this. And those of us who do know need to continue to share the story of this epic silent protest parade. The letters from Du Bois to James Weldon Johnson cover many decades and many topics, weighty matters, as well as friendly matters. They include Du Bois encouraging Johnson to be head of the NAACP. A note here on the right, inviting Johnson to the second Amenia Conference in Troutbeck. You see letters here related to Black Reconstruction, including one from James Weldon Johnson saying, "I forgot to get my copy signed by you." And then there's a note from Du Bois saying, "Here's the autograph for you." And the closeness of Du Bois and James Weldon Johnson can be seen in these letters with Grace Nell Johnson, Du Bois's widow. On the left, from the papers here at Yale, are a letter from Du Bois after James Weldon Johnson was killed in a car crash, and then also letters from him after his first wife, Grace, died. When she died, she was buried in Great Barrington. The Johnsons had a home nearby, and Du Bois spent some time that summer with Grace Nell Johnson as he was mourning his wife's loss. This birthday greeting from Du Bois to Johnson again underscores the closeness. And as David Levering Lewis notes, Du Bois only had about a half dozen real soulmates who were men. They included James Weldon Johnson, George Crawford, who we've just met, and Joel Spingarn. The Spingarn collection in the archives at Yale are another place that one can find much of Du Bois. Here you see a letter from 1910. The correspondence continues for many decades. And you can see in these letters the disputes that went on within the NAACP, the disputes that were where Du Bois was oftentimes the subject of attack from various folks. And you see those play out in these letters, including the one on the right that notes confidential to Spingarn. You see much about Du Bois also in the Anson, Phelps, Stokes papers. Anson, Phelps, Stokes, a graduate of Yale, would found the Phelps Stokes Fund in 1911. And you see many different letters from Du Bois to Anson, Phelps, Stokes, including a letter here asking for support for his encyclopedia in 1940. And you see that continuing through the 1950s. And I love this letter on the right, where Stokes, himself quite old, is writing to Du Bois on his 90th birthday and says, "Although I have not seen you at all in recent years and have not always been in sympathy with some of your public utterances, I must, for old time's sake, send you a word of congratulation on your 90th birthday." And again, one can see the triumphs and the tribulations that Du Bois faced in these correspondences in the archives. Du Bois is also quite present in the Langston Hughes papers. Du Bois was one of the early publishers of Langston Hughes. Hughes won poetry prizes from the Crisis, and Du Bois was a great patron of poetry. He himself would describe poetry as, quote, wisdom clothed in beauty. On the right is a letter from 1941 where Du Bois writes to Hughes, "I appreciate your kind note of May 17th. And he says, you have done much to be proud of since June 1921, which is when they first encountered each other." In the Hughes papers and in other papers, there are a number of items related to an interesting story, an important relationship of the Du Bois family, and that is the wedding of Countee Cullen to Yolande Du Bois. As David Levering Lewis notes, the Du Bois-Cullen nuptial was the Harlem event, social event of the decade. You see here the invitation to Langston Hughes. There's an invitation to Carl Van Vechten in his papers. As Lewis notes, 1,000 spectators watched 1,500 participants dressed to the nines file into Salem Methodist Church in Harlem. It was on Easter Monday, April 9, 1928. The Countee Cullen collection, donated by Harold Jackman as part of the James Weldon Johnson Memorial Collection, has letters from Countee Cullen to Jackman, including this one in 1925, where he is beginning to get to know Yolande Du Bois. It includes letters from Countee Cullen to Langston Hughes, asking Mr. Hughes to be part of the wedding, telling him that swallowtails it is, and then inviting him to other celebrations around it. In the Countee Cullen collection, there's also a note back from Hughes about the wedding to Yolande Du Bois, W.B. Du Bois's daughter, that says, I'll be part of the wedding, can't be around for one of the parties. What is interesting about the wedding, among other things, is that it didn't last. And it's a famous story. The wedding was the social event of the season. They were divorced in fairly short order. Countee Cullen was someone who had great loves, including a great love for Harold Jackman. Countee Cullen and Yolande Du Bois had a short honeymoon, but not long after the wedding, Countee Cullen sailed to Europe. Along with him was Harold Jackman, which led one of the black tabloids of the day to have the headline that's become quite well known, quote, "Groom sails with best man." On the right is a photograph of Harold Jackman by Carl Van Vechten. On the left are some of the many letters from Countee Cullen to Harold Jackman, donated by Jackman to the Yale archives. There are also 104 letters from Yolande Du Bois to Countee Cullen from 1923, when they first got to know each other, through 1930, through their courtship, their wedding, and then the one on the right is one of the last, if not the last, in the collection. And she writes to Countee Cullen, in regards to our reconciliation, do as you like. I was perfectly willing to try again, and still am. I believe that both of us tried sincerely, we could succeed, but if you'd rather not, well, suit yourself. This is again a story that is interesting and encourage folks to get to know more on your own in the archives here and elsewhere. Du Bois remained respectful of Countee Cullen, despite the fact that the marriage did not succeed. And he wrote this memorial tribute to Countee Cullen when Cullen died in 1946, where he says the death of Countee Cullen at the early age of 42 is an irreparable loss. And then finally, the connections of Du Bois to New Haven and to the archives at Yale are the Du Bois collection itself. It includes correspondence and writings. It's in 5 boxes, items presented by Dr. Du Bois, as well as items from other persons. It includes correspondence with some key figures. It includes many writings, both journal articles, as well as manuscripts and typescripts of monographs of books. One of the key items is Du Bois's master's thesis in philosophy at Harvard, The Renaissance of Ethics, which contains notes and comments by his professor and great mentor, William James. You can see in this document that there are some early examples of infographics. Of course, 10 years later, Du Bois would do the epic Paris Exposition, the World's Fair, and do extraordinary infographics, which are currently on view at the Cooper Hewitt Museum. The Du Bois collection donated by Dr. Du Bois includes some early drafts and other drafts, later drafts of his autobiography, Dusk of Dawn. It includes substantial materials related to his 1947 book, The World in Africa. On the right, you can see just how much there is in terms of lists of portraits, tables of contents, postscripts, outlines, drafts, and drafts, and drafts. There's also in the collection subject files, including original material of the first N.A.A.C.P conference and the second N.A.A.C.P conference, some materials related to the N.A.A.C.P, and lots of material related to the 1947 petition to the United Nations regarding the denial of human rights to minorities in the United States. Here you see an example of the papers and something that is a literal example of cut and paste. Those who only know Born Digital may not know there was actually something in editing and putting things together called cut and paste, and you see that process here. Du Bois called together leading scholars when he was working at the N.A.A.C.P in 1946-47 to do this work of scholarship that was the basis of a petition to the United Nations that called out the United States as being in violation of international human rights because of its treatment of Black Americans. This is a document that my bet is many in this audience don't know. It is again a story like the 1917 protest parade, worthy of remembrance, and it has great resonance down to our present day. Finally, Du Bois's last message to the world, which was something he wrote and gave to Shirley Graham Du Bois in the 1950s to be released upon his death. As some would know, Du Bois died in Ghana on August 27, 1963, the eve of the March on Washington, August 28, 1963, in Washington, D.C., an event which he had laid much of the groundwork for over the many decades of his life. In his last message to the world, Du Bois said, "One thing alone I charge you, as you live, believe in life. Always human beings will live and progress to greater, broader, and fuller life. The only possible death is to lose belief in this truth, simply because the great end comes slowly, because time is long." Those words of Du Bois, as well as his earlier words, continue to ring out. On the left, you see a picture of our colleague Kwame Akoto-Bonfo at the Du Bois Center and Mausoleum in Accra. Next week will mark W.E.B. Du Bois's 155th birthday. In the archives here at Yale, we have many things about Du Bois's birthdays. The programs that Langston Hughes and James Weldon Johnson had for his 70th birthday. On the right, James Weldon Johnson had many of the other people who were there, including Spingarn, Du Bois himself, Nina Gomer Du Bois, sign it. We have materials related to his 80th birthday in 1948. We have materials related to the decennial, Du Bois's 90th birthday party in 1958, where 1,000 people hailed him. We have an article from his 92nd birthday. At that point, he and Shirley Graham were living in Ghana. And we have an item related to a tribute to him the year after he died, his first birthday after his death, in February 23rd, 1964. I share this because it's worth remembering. Next Thursday is Du Bois's 155th birthday. There will be celebrations in Ghana. So if you happen to be near Accra, go to the Du Bois Museum. And there will be celebrations, no doubt, elsewhere. But I also encourage you to make your own celebration. Du Bois contained multitudes. Du Bois spanned 2 centuries and in many ways defined the 20th century and our own century. He is in history, but he is for our times and beyond. On the left is a picture at the Du Bois gravesite, Shirley Graham and W.B. Du Bois. I'm pictured there with Jeffrey Peck, one of W.B. Du Bois's two great grandsons. And on the right is a celebration at the Du Bois Center last August 27th. Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, and others who are supporting the effort to uplift the legacy of Du Bois in Ghana, in the United States, and all around the world. It is an effort that all of us can be part of by knowing his work, understanding his work, and sharing his work. Thanks for joining with us this afternoon.